hope you've already felt something of God's kindness this morning. I feel so touched by God's kindness towards us. And that's come through all the different words this morning. My prayer for us today is that through this quite heavy topic, I don't know if anybody's read chapters 7 and 8 in preparation, but my prayer is that throughout we would know and experience the kindness of God through the challenge that we're going to hear in these chapters. We're at chapters 7 and 8. Both John Bailey and John Lewis have opened up chapters 1 to 6 really brilliantly in the last few weeks. And I'd really encourage you to go and listen to those if you haven't heard them yet. But if you haven't been here, let me just recap. The book of Amos is set around the 8th century BC. And it records the words of Amos, a prophet, to the people of God. And the nation at that point had split into two, Israel and Judah. But actually they were in a season of relative peace and prosperity. And to be honest, when I first read these chapters, I had to go and get my son's easy-to-read version because it's quite a difficult passage. And I read it and I just didn't understand any of it, which was a great start when you know you're going to be preaching on something. And also, it's a challenging read. It's a tricky read. We're going to zoom in on some of the key verses and the verses that I've really wrestled with over the last few weeks and months. But actually, like with any story, if you if you pick up a book and you head to, chapter 12 of a 24-chapter book, you're really going to struggle to understand what is going on, and you might misunderstand what's actually happening in the story. And so my aim this morning is not just to delve into these verses, but it's also to help us just to step back and just take in the whole picture of the Bible, the whole story. And I found that's the only way I've managed to get my head around some of the trickier parts of these chapters. And we've been looking in the last few weeks about how Amos has been bringing to light the sins of the nation surrounding Israel and Judah, but then he's gone on to highlight the sins of Israel. And as he's highlighted those, he's been calling them to return to God. And we're in these chapters, we're now going to look at what God is saying to the people of Israel is going to happen to them if they don't return to the Lord. And I have to be honest, there are parts of the Bible that would actually just be easier to ignore. And this is some of those chapters. But actually, if we miss out on all the passages, if we take some passages out, you miss out on the full story, you miss out on the bigger picture, and we miss out on our understanding of God. So it is really important that we wrestle with some of the harder passages in the Bible. And the backdrop for these prophecies, these visions that we're going to see, is that God has created the world, featuring Adam and Eve. And as we know, they've sinned, they've fallen short, and they've disobeyed God. And therefore, the whole of humankind is under the judgment of sin. Everyone is destined to death and destruction because everyone sins. And so God sees the state of the world, and he chooses a people group, starting with Abraham. And he says these words over them. He says, "I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse, and all peoples on earth will be blessed through you." And then from Abraham comes this people, and God speaks these words over them in Deuteronomy 7. He says, "For you are a people holy to the Lord your God. The Lord your God has chosen you out of all of the people on the face of the earth to be his people, his treasured possession. And he makes this covenant with them, saying, if you pay attention to these laws and are careful to follow them, then the Lord your God will keep his covenant of love with you, as he swore to your ancestors." And then in Deuteronomy 8, he says, "If you ever forget the Lord your God and follow other gods and worship and bow down to them, I testify against you today that you will surely be destroyed. Like the nations the Lord destroyed before you, so you will be destroyed for not obeying the Lord your God. So they can choose to be part of his people and receive his blessing and be used as a blessing for the whole world, or they can choose to disobey his commandments and be treated like the rest of humanity that doesn't worship God. So we're at this point in history in the book of Amos where God is pointing back to this covenant that he's made with his people. And he's saying to them, I chose you so that I would be able to bless you, but also bless the rest of the world. But you've turned your back on me, and therefore I have to be faithful to my covenant and remove my blessing. But always, always, always with the hope that his people would return to him. Because God's arms are always open wide, ready to welcome us back. And in this passage, God asks Amos the same question twice. He says, Amos, what do you see? So throughout these passages, we're going to look at the things that God allows Amos to see. And I'm going to be asking us that question. What do you see in these verses? Because actually what we see is going to be very telling about how we see God, how we see ourselves, and ultimately how we see Jesus. So firstly, how we see God. At the start of this passage, God shows Amos some visions of what is going to happen to the people of Israel if they don't repent. And it says, this is what the sovereign Lord showed me. He was preparing swarms of locusts after the king's share had been harvested and just as the late crops were coming up. And then he says, the sovereign Lord was calling for judgment by fire. It dried up the great deep and devoured the land. So judgment is coming on the people of God, and he's using this imagery of locusts and of fire to warn them that they're going to be invaded and that they're going to be destroyed. And so when I first read this, my kind of instinctive reaction was to read it through the lens of my human experience, obviously, because that's all I've got. And if I'm really honest, I said to God, it feels a little bit, and I don't know whether I'm allowed to say this, it feels a little bit petty. A little bit like a child saying to their friend, if you don't play with me, I'm not going to be your friend anymore. And, I have to be honest, that's a little bit kind of how I've always felt about this covenant. If you don't follow my rules, I'm not going to bless you. I'm not going to be your friend anymore. And I said, God, is that really the God that I know and love and worship? Is that really what you're saying? And I felt God challenge me and say, what part of this covenant do you have a problem with? Do you have a problem with the fact that there's a consequence to sin? Now, I've got 3 kids, and so the parent in me who spent a lifetime disciplining my children, I get that bit. I get that there has to be a consequence to sin. And then I felt God say, is it because I warned my people that there was going to be a consequence? Is that what you have a problem with? And again, the parent in me who's spent half a lifetime, giving my children warnings, I understand that part. I get that part. And then I felt God say, is it because I'm warning them that this is going to happen imminently? And again, the parent in me, who doesn't ever want to go through the trauma of having to discipline their kids because it's hard work having to follow through, I understand that. And then I felt God say, is it that the consequence of sin feels really harsh? And I guess that's where I landed. And then I just felt God give me this picture to help me to understand. If you've ever heard me speaking before, you'll know that God often speaks to me through toddlers. That's kind of the level of my understanding. That's why I enjoy, the 2 and 3-year-olds in the church. And I had this picture of God standing at the side of a really busy motorway, and he was holding a toddler by the hand. And he was saying to this toddler, if you hold onto my hand and you stay with me, you're going to be safe. But if you let go and you run into the road, you're going to get destroyed. And suddenly, that harsh warning feels a bit different, doesn't it? Because you could say to the toddler, if you let go of my hand and run into the road, you might get a little bump or a little graze. Or you could say, if you let go of my hand and run into the road, you're not going to get any pudding tonight. But that wouldn't be loving or kind, would it? So truthfully, he says to his people, if you let go of my hand and don't heed my warnings, you're going to get destroyed. So I wonder what you see when you hear these warnings. Do you see a petty, vindictive God giving an over-the-top consequence? Or do you see a loving Father giving a consequence that's rooted in a right understanding of how destructive sin is? And the other thing to note about these two pictures is that when Amos sees these pictures, these visions, he points out to God the fact that the people of God, they're not going to survive these things. And he pleads with God to relent. And then immediately, straight away, as if he's just been waiting for somebody to jump in, God relents. And he says both times, so the Lord relented. This will not happen. And it's blatant here what's at play. There are two things at play for God. God hates sin and he loves his people. And throughout the whole of the Bible, that's the dynamic that we see at play. God is just and God is loving. And when you see God act, you always see these two things at work. And then the next two pictures that we see are that of a wall with a plumb line and a basket of ripe fruit. And so it says in verse 7, this is what he showed me. The Lord was standing by a wall that had been built true to plumb, with a plumb line in his hand. And the Lord asked me, what do you see, Amos? A plumb line, I replied. Then the Lord said, look, I am setting a plumb line among my people Israel. I will spare them no longer. And then the next picture is in Amos 8, and it says, this is what the sovereign Lord showed me, a basket of ripe fruit. What do you see, Amos? He asked. A basket of ripe fruit, I answered. Then the Lord said to me, the time is ripe for my people Israel. I will spare them no longer. And a plumb line is a tool that builders use to make sure that walls were built straight. And God's covenant laws, they were given as a plumb line to show the people of Israel how to live lives that were right before God. They were instructions on how to live life in such a way that you live life as God intended you to live it. It's not a list of what to do to make God happy. It's not a list of things to do to stay out of trouble. They're instructions from a creator to his creatures on how to live the most fulfilling, satisfying life. And it's clear that the people of Israel were no longer following these laws. They were living in such a way that they'd completely missed the point. They'd completely distorted God's purpose for them. They were like this bowl of ripe fruit that was ready to be eaten. And interestingly, with these two visions, Amos doesn't ask God to relent because he sees what God sees. He sees the wall that is so crooked that it can't just be readjusted. It has to be torn down and rebuilt. And he sees that bowl of fruit that is it's too far gone. So I wonder what you see in this picture. Do you see a God who just doesn't like disobedient children? Or do you see a holy, loving Father who wants the very best for his children? And then these chapters, they don't only reveal to us how we see God, they also reveal to us how we see ourselves. And in the next part of chapter 7, we hear about a priest who was very unhappy with Amos, and he was very unhappy with what Amos was saying over the nation of Israel. And he's offended by them because obviously he's implicated as a priest. So he turns on Amos and he tells the king that Amos is causing trouble and unrest. And he orders him to stop speaking God's words. And he says, "Get out, you seer. Go back to the land of Judah. Earn your bread there and do your prophesying there. Don't prophesy anymore at Bethel, because this is the king's sanctuary and the temple of the kingdom." So Amos, he replies by reminding Amaziah the priest that God is the one who made him a prophet. He was just a shepherd, as we saw in part 1, that he was just a shepherd when God called him. And then he goes on to speak these words of judgment over the priest. He says, "Therefore, this is what the Lord says. Your wife shall become a prostitute in the city, and your sons and daughters will fall by the sword. Your land will be measured and divided up, and you yourself will die in a pagan country. And Israel will surely go into exile away from their native land." Now, I don't know about you, but that doesn't sit very easily with me. If somebody was to come up here on a Sunday morning and started prophesying that over our leaders and their wives, they'd probably very quickly be escorted out, wouldn't they? But as I kind of came to God with my questions about, this warning, I suddenly realized I felt convicted by God that I was more offended by Amos's words to the priest than the fact that the priest had asked Amos to stop speaking his words. I was more shocked by the words of judgment that Amos had over the priest than the fact that the priest was so blind to his own sin and the state of the nation that he'd asked God's people to be quiet and please be more politically correct. And God is warning the priest that he is on the road that leads to destruction. Just like John shared that brilliant picture last week about the people of God walking to the edge of the cliff, but actually they were so distracted by what was in front of them that they didn't see where they were headed. And in Matthew 7, Jesus puts this message like this. He says, "For the gate is wide and the way is easy that leads to destruction, and those who enter by it are many. For the gate is narrow and the way is hard that leads to life, and those who find it are few. There's a path in life that leads to destruction." And the people of God were on that path. They were heading to the edge of the cliff. And for some, like the priest's wife, it was going to end in prostitution. For others, it was going to mean being destroyed by the sword. For others, it would mean exile. But God was committed to showing his people where their path was leading to, in the hope that they would return back to him. So again, I wonder what you see in this passage. Do you see an over-the-top threat from a vengeful God? Or a holy, loving God who's committed to warning his people that the path that they were on was leading straight to destruction? Now, I wonder what it is that you've had in mind when you've been thinking about the sins of the people of God. And if you've been here in previous weeks, we've seen some of them. But when we tend to think about sin, we tend to think about the big things, don't we? We think about murder, we think about adultery. And so we're going to look at what actually it is that God zooms in on when he's talking about the sins of his people. And this was also in last week's passage. It says, "Hear this, you who trample on the needy and bring the poor of the land to an end, saying, when will the new moon be over that we may sell grain, and the Sabbath that we may offer wheat for sale, that we may make the ephah small and the shekel great, and deal deceitfully with false balances, that we may buy the poor for silver and the needy for a pair of sandals and sell the chaff of the wheat." That is what God was zooming in on. Now, please don't switch off thinking, well, this isn't relevant to me because, I don't trample on the needy in Canterbury. If you're anything like me, you probably just walk around them. And you don't finish off the poor in Kent, just leave them where they are. And you don't buy the poor with silver or the needy with a pair of sandals. Maybe, like me, you just buy from big companies that do it for you when they don't pay the living wage and when their working conditions overseas are absolutely atrocious. So maybe a little bit more in this passage for us than we're maybe initially prepared to admit. So let's not, switch off. And I wanted to contrast these words with the words of blessing that God spoke over his people in Genesis, right at the start, in Genesis 12 that we looked at earlier. It says, I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you, and I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you I will curse, and all the people on earth will be blessed through you. That was God's heart for the people of Israel, that all the people on earth would be blessed through them. Instead, they're trampling on the poor, they're bringing the poor of the land to an end, and they're so focused on profit that they want the Sabbath to be over so that they can go back to making money. I'd say that's quite a long way off from being a conduit of God's blessing to the world. They weren't even able to look after their own people, let alone the rest of the world. They weren't treating each other well, let alone the rest of the world. So suddenly that plumb line looks really straight, doesn't it? And the wall looks really crooked. And in this passage, God is saying, I will not tolerate my people treating the poor and needy like this. In our house, I'm sad to say, there's an insult that keeps making an appearance. Not between Simon and I, I'd like to add, between the kids. It's this, it's you little rat. Yeah. And my standard response with this is, I am not okay with anybody calling my kids names, even if it's one of my other kids doing the calling. So what do you see in this passage? A demanding father who holds his children to a standard that's maybe just too high, or a loving, holy father who is insisting on his children being treated well and treating one another well. And so when I've been reading this passage, I've realized how much I underplay the severity of sin in the world and in my own life. And essentially I was shocked at the severity of the consequences because I downplay sin in my life. And I just felt God to really highlight to me through this passage how serious sin is, how serious its consequences are, and how destructive sin is. It's not a neutral thing that happens in a void. All sin is against God and against either ourselves or other people. And when Jesus is asked, what is the most important of all the commandments? He says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength. And the second is this, love your neighbor as yourself. There is no commandment greater than these. So sin is anything that we do that isn't loving God or loving a neighbour. And that's a little bit more, isn't it, than just avoiding murdering or adultery. And I think if I went round this morning and asked you how you feel about sin, I wonder what honest answers you'd give to me. And when I came to God with my reaction about the severity, really, of the judgment, I just felt God say to me, Carrie, how do you feel about cancer? And if I went round this morning and asked us how we feel about cancer, I think I'd probably get a stronger reaction from people about cancer than about sin. Because we see, don't we? We see the direct effect of cancer on people. And actually, most of us in our lives have been affected by cancer in one way or another. We get it. Do we get it about sin? And we are going to get to the good part soon, but it's really important that we understand the difficult parts first before we get to the good part. And I certainly feel like I haven't had a right understanding of sin and the severity of sin. And in these chapters, we see, don't we? We see a God who is absolutely committed to eradicating sin for the health of his children. So when I think about God overreacting over sin, it's a little bit like me saying that a parent is overreacting when their child gets a cancer diagnosis. So what do you see? Do you see maybe good people who've made a few poor choices, or sinful people who rightly deserve God's wrath? Because actually that's likely how you see yourself. Do you consider yourself maybe to generally be a good person who's maybe made a few mistakes? Or do you consider yourself to be a sinful person who rightly deserves God's wrath? Now, I'm mostly addressing the believers in the room, because actually we can get really familiar with these truths, can't we? And we can lose the seriousness of it. But it's also a question that is worth considering if you don't call yourself a Christian today. You know, people who generally call themselves or consider themselves good people are using the world's standard. And actually, maybe by the world's standard, you are a really, really good person. But actually, God's standards are completely different to the world's standards. And we're going to finish now with a verse in chapter 8 that is absolutely mind-blowing. Listen to this. We're going to see a glimpse of Jesus in these verses. See if you can see some clues that point to what everything is going to culminate in. It's in chapter 8, verse 9. In that day, declares the sovereign Lord, I will make, and he's talking about the day of judgment. In that day, I will make the sun go down at noon and darken the earth in broad daylight. I will turn your religious festivals into mourning and all your singing into weeping. I will make all of you wear sackcloth and shave your heads. I will make that time like mourning for an only son, and the end of it like a bitter day. Obviously, we've not long had Easter, so the sun going down at noon and darkening the earth in broad daylight, it should be sounding really familiar. And obviously, verse 10, mourning as for an only son, will also be ringing bells for us. This passage is directly pointing us to what is to come with Jesus. And so God, our holy, loving Father, who is just and loving in equal measures, He found a way to deal with his hatred of sin and his love for people. He chose his only son, and he poured his wrath on him. And Paul Tripp, who's an American author, calls it his grace-infused wrath. He poured his grace-infused wrath, his judgment on sin, onto Jesus. And Jesus was willing to come and to be one of us and to take his loving Father's judgment, because he loved his Father and he loves us. Us, the sinners, the objects of God's wrath. And so the sun went down and the earth went dark, because the light of the world was receiving in his body the grace-infused wrath of God. So what do you see? Do you see Jesus? Actually, when we see God for who he is, and when we see ourselves for who we are, and we don't cover up the uncomfortable parts of who we are, that's where we encounter true faith and true repentance. And again, Paul Tripp says this. He says, true religion begins with the devastating acknowledgement of sin. True religion mourns corruption within, which cannot be defeated without divine intervention. True religion never has human righteousness at the center. No, it has the amazing grace of a self-sacrificing Saviour at the center. True religion never produces self-assured religious pride. It does not produce soul-crushing legalism. In the soil of true religion, humanity, love, gratitude, grace, peace, and dependency on God grow. The Israelites thought they were seeing it right. They thought they could just make things right with God by doing the right things. But they weren't loving God and they weren't loving their neighbours. So, what does all of this mean for us? How do we make sure that we are seeing things the right way? How do we make sure we're not blindly walking, towards the edge of the cliff? And I was thinking about this one morning in my devotional, and while I was reflecting on it, I had in the back of my mind that my daughter had gone out for a run on her own, and I kept checking my phone to see where she was. And as I was doing that, I just was reminded of the verse in Hebrews 12 that says, "Therefore, since we're surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles, and let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of faith. For the joy set before him, he endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Consider him who endured such opposition from sinners, so that you will not grow weary and lose heart." And I went to a funeral this last week of a really dear Christian friend, Bill. Some of you might remember him. He was in our church many years ago, Bill Law. And he was in his mid-70s, and I had the chance while I was there to chat with his wife and chat to a couple in their 80s who used to lead this church. And what really struck me about both of these couples was that they were still running the race. They spent their whole lives throwing off the things that hinder and getting rid of the sin that entangles, and they were running with perseverance the race that had been marked out for them. And they fixed their eyes on Jesus throughout their life, and they were running. And actually, our friend Bill has now won the prize with Jesus. So I wonder what you're fixing your eyes on. What are you walking? What are you running towards? All of us are either walking distractedly towards the edge of the cliff, or we're running towards a loving Father whose arms are always, always, always open wide to welcome us back. And maybe you are running, but you're weighed down. And I wonder what it is that maybe you need to throw off in order to run with perseverance. And the answers are going to be different for each one of us. For me, I tend to get very distracted by a lot of things. So actually, I have to be quite strict. I can't read novels because I just get so engrossed in them that everything else just falls to the side. It's not great for family life. I can't have games on my phone because I just get so addicted and so distracted by them. There's certain things on TV that I can't watch. I just get sucked in and it takes over my thoughts and my time. I've recently stopped watching Grey's Anatomy just because I just was getting sucked in. And it doesn't affect my husband at all in the same way. That we're all wired differently, aren't we? But for me, it's not a healthy habit. I've had to take Facebook and Instagram off my phone, I just have to access it on the laptop. And I'm also going through a season of abstaining from buying clothes because that's one of my distractions in life. And they're all things that aren't necessarily wrong in themselves, but for me, they slow me down and they hinder me from running the race that God has got for me. So can I just encourage you to take time and consider, what are you fixing your eyes on? What do you need to throw off? Let's make sure that we're not like the Israelites. And if you're here today and you don't consider yourself to be a Christian, can I encourage you just to think, where are you heading? Where are you walking towards? What are you running towards? And we're going to be running a daytime alpha course this term, and it starts in a few weeks. It's on a Friday morning, and we'd love to have you come and join us and take some time just to consider those things about where are you going in life, where are you running, and come to chat to me afterwards about it. I'd love to give you more information. But if God is speaking to you now, in this moment, don't let this opportunity pass you by. His arms are always open wide, ready to welcome us into a relationship with him.